ready to begin. And we're live.
A warm welcome to this ICDE webinar on quality assurance and assessment. The second one in our webinar series from ICDE's Quality Network, International Reflections and Lessons Learned during the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Torunn Gjelsvik. I'm the Secretary General of ICDE, the International Council for Open and Distance Education. And for those of you who are new to us, ICDE is the leading global membership organization for open, flexible, and distance education. We have 200 plus members and partners in over 75 countries in all world regions. Our members are mostly represented by higher education institutions, but we also have individual members and student members. And these members engage in our activities, which can be projects, conferences, and events, networks, and committees like the Quality Network, which stands behind this particular webinar series. I will now introduce today's moderator. This is Professor Emeritus of Distance Education and Development from the Open University of UK, Alan Tate. He is a long-standing ambassador for ICDE and a previous member of our executive committee. Alan is also the chair for ICDE's Quality Network, consisting of 7 focal points and experts in online and distance education, representing all world regions. Please, Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tarun, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody all around the world. The level of interest in this webinar is extraordinary. I think that is because, at least in part, the topic of COVID pandemic and assessment in our field is of such enormous interest. Well, I'm sitting here in Cambridge in England. It's the very last warm day of our summer. Tomorrow we have cold and wet weather, but I hope wherever you are comfortable and safe. So let me just introduce 1 or 2 administrative points, first of all, for our webinar. I need to let you know that the webinar will be recorded and the slides and the recording will be available after the webinar has finished. So we'll send you an email link with the recording and the slides. Very importantly, if you want to contribute to the discussion after our speakers have made their contribution, please use the Q&A box. So that's not the chat box, but please use the Q&A box, and I will draw on questions and issues that you raise there and share them with our speakers. I should let you know that we have, at last reckoning, some 423 registrants from maybe 40 countries around the world. So ICDE really does live up to its global reputation. You might also like to know that the webinar will be live streamed on the ICDE YouTube channel. So we're live. And lastly, and importantly, Tarun has mentioned that this is the second webinar, and there will be 1 more webinar later this year in November. The date is yet to be finalized, but if you follow ICDE on social media, you'll be able to find out when that webinar is, as well as checking out what other offerings come up from ICDE. So the topic today of assessment in our field is of enormous importance. Certainly in the UK, we were hit in March by the news that all university and school campuses would be closed down. And suddenly the issue of how we were going to organise end-of-year assessment was very pressing. The habit of bringing everybody together into exam halls to sit their examinations together was simply no longer possible. And this has hit the field of higher education all around the world. And it's created a huge amount of innovation, which I think is where this interest comes from. Assessment had to be remote. There was a big impact. There has been a big impact on the student experience. There are questions, important questions about academic integrity in new ways of doing things. We've had to ask new questions about assessment for learning, as well as how we judge performance. There have been big questions about the robustness of IT systems in some countries and how well they will support remote assessment systems. So all around the world, these issues, some at least of them, have raised their head. Now, the structure for our webinar today is that we're going to ask our 2 distinguished speakers to make their contributions, probably for 10 to 15 minutes each. And then I will go through the question and answer box and bring out questions and issues that you want to raise with them. And we're going to begin with our first speaker, our Professor Santiago Acosta Aide. Let me just give you a brief introduction to Professor Acosta Aide's background. He's a very distinguished international academic. His field is in Spanish American literature, and he is the rector of the private technical University of Loja in Ecuador, UTPL, Ecuador. He's also got a wide international experience, having been a professor in Peru, Russia, Bolivia, as well as Ecuador. And he's worked significantly in a number of university management positions. Importantly for this event, Professor Acosta Aide is the Executive Secretary of the Latin American and Caribbean Institute for Quality in Distance Higher Education, or CALED. So Professor Acosta Aide is very well positioned to talk to us this afternoon about COVID and assessment. So, Professor Acosta Aide, may I please hand over to you?
Thank you very much for the introduction. And I would like to thank ICDE for the opportunity to take part in this webinar series on education, quality, and COVID, specifically Torun Gjelsvik, the moderator, Alan Tate, and the person in charge of logistics, Julie Shearing. And it's also an honor for me to share the webinar with Dr. Yaping Gao from Quality Matters, USA. First, I will begin by commenting on some elements of the Latin American context during the pandemic. Secondly, I will focus on the challenges universities will face when the new normality arrives. This is a map of it's in Spanish, I'm sorry for that, but it's just a general overview of the massive closure of educational institutions worldwide. It is important to note that higher education institutions have sent millions of on-campus mode students home, and they were not ready for distance study, nor were universities and faculty. As shown in the image, the closure of face-to-face activities has been extremely rapid in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean. It began on March 12th in Colombia and Peru, and in 6 days reached almost the entire population of higher education students and teachers in the region. By March 17th, 21.7 million students and 1.3 million teachers had been affected by closures. The sudden closure of universities caused face-to-face lectures to move online. That's a fact. But this was an unplanned decision. I see a risk here, the possibility of open and distance education acquiring a bad image in the public eye. The education version that classroom-based institutions have staffed into digital form has replicated regular in-class teaching on virtual platforms. So synchronous online classes presented by teachers have been predominant. I think that the shortcomings are evident. The most important one is the lack of educational design. Experts alert us that this educational situation cannot be called online education, but only emergency remote education. If users confuse this kind of education with actual digital learning, this mistake is negative for the public image of distance education. The educational crisis has had in Latin America and the Caribbean many negative consequences, such as financial burdens on student families, difficulties with telework, the reduction in the number of jobs, the financial sustainability of private universities, the cut of funding for public universities, and I will focus on just one aspect that the crisis has highlighted, the digital divide, as well as issues related to digital skills. A survey conducted by UNESCO chairs in Latin America and the Caribbean showed that the main concerns for students during the pandemic was the lack of connectivity. On the side of universities, fully face-to-face universities have found it difficult to cope with disruptions caused by the crisis. One example is the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina, which ranks among the top 100 best universities in the world, according to the QS ranking. It has 320,000 students and over 100 degree programs. The university decided to move classes online when the pandemic was declared, but because of technology issues, the authorities scheduled the beginning of the on-campus classes 3 months later. Classes finally moved online, but only partially. In summary, these are some of the pitfalls encountered by universities in the pandemic. Conversely, ODL universities had no issues in advancing their academic activities. Technologies have proved to be more inclusive, something we already knew, but they have helped overcome barriers not only of space and time, but also disruptions caused by emergencies and crises. In general, Latin American universities have few tenured teachers. Most of them are temporary faculty. As a result of the reduction in student enrollment, part-time teachers and teachers with a temporary contract are more likely to lose their jobs. Currently, all universities have at least a few programs online or use a virtual platform as a support for face-to-face lectures. But even within this context, universities have struggled to make the transition from on-campus lectures to fully online delivery. In some good universities, it has happened that the transition was impossible because of faculty opposition. That has been the case with famous and strong federal universities in Brazil, where rectors didn't have the strength to enforce the change of modality because unions of teachers opposed the measure on the ground of quality concerns. The result has been an interruption of academic operations for months. This is a clear indication that the key factor is not technology, but teachers. If teachers are not ready to work in a new teaching environment, they may short-circuit political decisions. One of the lessons learned from the crisis is that teachers skilled in acting within online environments had more chances to adapt to sudden changes like the ones experienced in the crisis. There are also impacts on students, although in general we can assume that they have had fewer issues adapting to the new online mode of learning. But the lack of adequate workload planning may have led to problems in keeping up with assignments and course progress. Also, I would like to say that the main concern of students have been the technological inequality in the student population and the disaffection students have felt towards a learning environment in which they did not choose to study. Let us see now what the new normality will look like, in my opinion. It is clear that as a result of an educational emergency, technology-driven education has become mainstream in the past semester. It remains to be seen if this will continue to be the case in the upcoming semester. My guess is that different varieties of blended teaching and learning will take the lead, especially because universities will have to provide for practical activities to carry out. But what will happen when we get back to normal? Or what do universities have to do to take advantage of the experiences lived in the crisis? In my opinion, if universities are to learn lessons from the emergency, the main challenge they need to meet is going ahead with digitalization of teaching and learning, probably through various ways of blended learning, but without ruling out going deeper into fully online programs, well distributed across faculties and schools. Leaders must take advantage of this huge experiment that their institutions are undergoing by immersing in digital learning. This doesn't involve simply adding more technology, something universities have already done, but implementing methodologies for online learning, developing major curricular changes, making educational innovation a must among teachers, and it is essential in this sense that each institution defines what kind of digital competence teacher it wants to achieve, since it is teachers who will define what kind of digital technologies they will apply to pursue the different learning objectives. Other challenges for the new normality are the following: a push for more inclusion and equity when the crisis is likely to have left behind thousands of students, curricular changes which allow students to have fewer synchronic sessions and more diversified learning activities, and reformulating financial budgets. Additional challenges: networking, consolidating alliances, and partnering for joining forces. New strategies for assessment, something Japing Gao is going to deal with in her presentation. And of course, this is a given, health protocols in place. Moreover, though I won't have time to elaborate on this, maintaining the jobs of faculty and staff is quite a challenge, though it is difficult given the reduction of student enrollments, especially in private universities. Teachers must be the leaders for academic innovation, but this calls for much training, and consequently, the teachers' workload should be reviewed or at least not increased if they are to innovate and drive changes within their institutions. The goal is to transition to learning-centric approaches. Other challenges are training students in digital skills, and even more than that, students must experience new ways of learning by being exposed to new active learning methodologies. Besides, universities should develop more online courses. Academic support is a key factor for student success, and additionally, universities must address the problem of emotional disorders suffered by students and teachers amidst the pressures the new normality will bring because of technology issues. The authorities rescheduled the beginning of the on-campus classes. I'm sorry, this is about the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. I was overlapping my notes.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Acosta Aide. That was a very, very interesting overview, and it's quite clear that your authoritative perspective comes from wide international experience. It's very valuable for this ICDE audience to see the breadth of vision you had drawn, especially from the Latin American and Caribbean contexts. Let me now come to our second speaker and make an introduction for Dr. Yaping Gao. Dr. Gao is the Senior Academic Director for Member Services and Partnerships at an organization called Quality Matters in the USA. So we're staying with the Americas, but we're moving now to North America and to the USA in particular. Dr. Gao has over 25 years experience in higher education, both in China and in the US, as a faculty instructional designer, LMS administrator, and an online education administrator. Dr. Gao's current position as Senior Academic Director at Quality Matters allows her to oversee and lead member services and partnerships with a focus on international outreach initiatives and collaborations. Dr. Gao's academic background comes with her doctoral degree from Baylor University in Texas, USA, and her master's and bachelor degrees from Shanghai International Studies University, Shanghai, China. So another colleague with a wide international background. Dr. Gao, may I now hand over to you?
Yes, so let me share screen, see if I can do this. Can you all see my screen now? Yes, right? Okay, so thank you, Professor Alan Tate, for the introduction, and thank you so much for Dr. Santiago Acastas. Very informative and very broad perspective on how COVID-19 has affected us all. I'm very honored to have this opportunity to represent Quality Matters, or QM, to participate in this wonderful event. And it is great to be able to connect with all of you here in the ICDE community from all over the world. QM is a US-based nonprofit organization leading quality assurance for online education and digital learning. QM focuses on the research-supported standards and provides many different types of professional development opportunities for faculty, instruction designers, and administrators. The other major focus of QM is on peer review to ensure the quality of online courses and the programs. The entire QM process is very adaptable and can be used to support institutions and organizations to reach their quality assurance goals. For the past 14, 15 years, QM has been working with expanding international community, and due to this pandemic, online education, and in particular, quality assurance in online education has become the very top priority for all education communities. So if you can see the map here, we have over 1,340 member institutions, and that's not including individual members in a total of 23 countries in all 6 inhabitable continents. We are very fortunate to be able to work with such a large community, and just this past few months, we are in the position not only to support online unit in institutions, but really to support all educators. When we talk about assessments, typically the first question faculty and the deans would ask, how do you ensure the quality or the integrity? How do you ensure the academic integrity in assessment when you move the courses into the online environment? I'm showing you on the screen. This is by NG Venture, a US-based research firm. They have identified actually 22 different products that they called assessment integrity solutions. So they have found that just in the US, there are over 1,300 institutions currently using over 2,400 different combinations of those hardware, software implementations. I'm certainly not going to go into any of those details because this is really a very strategic institutional decision, a big decision, and involve heavily, IT involvement and infrastructure, just regarding the hardware, software needed, the access, the data analysis, et cetera, et cetera. But just to give you overall impression of how technology can be used if implemented very appropriately at the institutional level to ensure the academic integrity of assessment, to provide such a secure and safe environment for assessments. If any of the colleagues here, if you would like more information, you know, at the end of this, I will share my email. You send them an email, I will send a link and, you know, all the information to you. So for my part, and I have seen in the chat, we have lots of professors and instructional designers here. So I would like to take this opportunity to actually share two considerations when we think about or rethink, or when we redesign our assessments so that they can be carried out and implemented in the online environment at the same time to ensure academic integrity other than the hardware, software. The first concept, or I call it the principle of alignment. And then the second one is really you want to design and build your course in such a way that it engages students. So just, I want to pause for a second just to let us to think about it. One is alignment, meaning all the course components from learning objectives to assessments to everything else that you put into the course needs to be aligned with one single goal. The goal is to ensure and to help students achieve learning outcomes. Second, in online environment, engagement needs to be designed, built into your course. It does not happen automatically. Okay. Okay, so what is alignment? So there's a famous quote here by Jim Wilkinson. I'm not going to read it, but basically it says, if you want to ensure students learn what they're supposed to learn, you start with the learning objectives, or in some institutions they call it learning outcomes, depends on how you look at the things. And you have a set of learning outcomes, and then you design, how am I going to assess my students whether they are achieving those learning outcomes or learning objectives. Then you build everything else in between to support, to reach that goal. The second piece about alignment is when we look at learning objectives and then you want to align them to your assessments, or you can say, I want to design, build my assessment to meet the learning outcomes. What exactly are we talking about? Okay, so if you are teaching a composition course, the final exam cannot be just yes or no multiple choices questions, right? They have to be, the students have to be able to write some composition, right, based on the goal. Also, if you're teaching a science course, has a very lab heavy components, right? You cannot just ask them to write an AC on something. It has to be able to, your final assessment, the capstone or the project have to show the student they have mastered the competencies. So I'm sure that a lot of faculty, and in particular our instructional designers here, are very aware of this taxonomy, right? So you start with, you know, needing students to know basic facts and trying to understand those concepts. And then you want to provide opportunities for the students to apply their knowledge and to analyze, to evaluate. And hopefully, you know, at a certain point, the students will be able to create something based on what they have learned in the course. Each course is a little, is very different depending on the, you know, content display, and depend on whether it's an undergraduate or graduate or or doctorate or even postdoctorate. But no matter what course at what level you need to have a varied combination of assess students on their different cognitive level. Slide, oops, went too far. Okay, so once you have determined what exactly you want your students to achieve, to learn, to master at the end of course, you really have to make sure your learning objectives are measurable. So you cannot just say, you know, at the end of the course, my students will be able to understand 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things. How are you going to assess understanding? So here is a very easy, clean diagram by Lida Hackney. And it has on the lower level, if you see, has the cognitive level, that the cognitive skills that you want your students to master to. And then on the lower upstairs, you will see these are the measurable action verbs. So if you say you want students to be able to define, then you probably, you know, can show some video or lecture. But if you want them to be able to explain something, then you probably want to post the questions, you know, discussion board or writing something. And then if you want them to be able to organize certain things, you probably want to organize or produce things. Then you want them to do some demonstration, do some projects. And if you want them to analyze things, then you probably can use case study or, you know, problem solving, etc. And on and on. And of course, you have the evaluation and the create level. These are the highest cognitive level. So your learning objectives outcome need to be measurable, and then you need to use the proper action verbs, measurable verbs, so that at the end you can actually use assessment to measure them. You can create the questions and the projects to actually measure them. So the other piece of alignment that I just mentioned is that once you have the objective aligned with assessment, then you look at your course components. So in the QM higher education standards, we have 8 categories of general standards. And if you look at the standards 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you have the learning objectives. You always start with learning objectives. And then you develop your assessment. And then you choose the proper course materials, the resources to support that students will be able to read, digest, understand the content. And then you also want to design your learning activities, because, you know, in the past, you know, probably a few decades ago, the traditional teaching and learning is you come to the class, you take the notes, and then the students will have a midterm and the final exam, and that's it. But in the online environment, the pedagogy, the course design is very different. Everything has to be designed ahead of time. Everything has to be aligned, and everything has to support each other. And so the midterm and the final exam only, that paradigm, that has to go. You know, this is perhaps one of the most challenging paradigm shift for faculty, because they're so used to give midterm and then the final, not in the online environment. You have to do formative assessment weekly, bi-weekly, and then you have give small quizzes and engage students with learning activities. And of course, you know, in the online environment, we all know technology, right? And there's dozens and dozens of new technologies coming out every day, you know. So we choose to use certain technology, certain tools, not because they're current, they're fancy, they're new, you know, I heard a lot of good things about them. Choose any technology that to use to meet your goal. Your goal is to help students to learn, help them to achieve the learning objectives. And if that's not the case, do not use it. Okay, so alignments among all the components. And then we talk about engagement. How do you engage students? In the traditional face-to-face classroom, we can be very spontaneous, right? Faculty give a lecture, ask students to ask questions, and we can stop at any time saying, okay, this seem to be challenging. Let's, talk a little bit more like that. You can be very spontaneous. You can engage the students, ask them questions, etc. In the online environment, everything has to be designed and built ahead of time because you're not talking to students like this, even if on the screen, you're not doing this synchronous all the time. So engagement and interaction do not happen automatically in the online environment. It has to be designed in advance. So show here is the kind of the diagram or the levels of interaction. So in the QM standards, we emphasize that in the online environment, interaction needs to be built in between students and course content. And that's the same, right? For face-to-face, for hybrid, for synchronous or not, students need to study the course material. So that's a given, okay? There's no question about that. And then you also need to design in such a way that the students has, many opportunities, in the online environment to interact with you as the faculty, as the instructor. That include, ask questions, or you provide feedback, or you provide your virtual office hours, etc., etc. And the third types of interaction is between students to students or learner to learner. And that depends, okay? That depends on what course it is and what size of the students' enrollment, et cetera, et cetera. But if appropriately, if it's appropriate, you need to build in students to students interaction. Even for large enrollment courses, if you have teaching assistant, the students can still be grouped into small teams to interact. Look here, if you look at the left side, there's a little diagram here. The online course, the online class needs to be user-friendly and student-centered, or a learning-centered environment where they are able to interact with the content, the resource, the material. They're able to interact with the instructor. They're able to interact with other learners, their peers, as well as easy to use technology, and all the content are accessible, and the resources and activities. On the right side, these are the QM standards, very specific QM standards that promote or encourage how to build in engagement and interactions. Authentic assessment and active learning, has proven to be another effective way to ensure academic integrity and assessments. And there's lots and lots of research done by the education community. Due to time constraint, I'm not going to delve into any of these, but on the screen, I just want to share with you one of the diagrams by Dustin Summy, who is the instructor and an instructor designer at the University of Central Arkansas. So at the center, the pyramid shows you again the taxonomy, right? The different cognitive levels that we have to consider when we want to assess students. What kind of skills that we want students to master at the end of the course. But then if you look out on the left column, these are some of the formative assessments you can give students, bi-weekly, if not every week, in order to ensure that they are on track and they're learning what they are supposed to be learning, so that at the end, there's not a big surprise. Oh, I did not know that, right? And on the right side, there's some some examples of what kind of summative assessments that you can do based on what cognitive level of skills that you want your students to learn. So again, if any of the audience here are interested in all of this information, email me at the end and I'll send all the resources to you. QM has been supporting the online community for the past 14, 15 years, but over the past few months, we really have been supporting the entire education community. So because traditionally, the majority of educators are face-to-face. So we have curated many resources on assessments. And here's the link. I'm not going to go there because it can be overwhelming. There's a long list of presentations and the papers and very specific concrete handouts on how to create assessments. And then most recently, the past few months, we have actually built and shared, and this is complimentary, like free to everybody in the education community. One is called the QM Emergency Remote Instruction Checklist. I know that we're kind of, we should be beyond the emergency remote instruction because that's March, April, etc. But there are a lot of institutions are still in that kind of mood because they just do not have enough resources to support all the faculty going online and the remote teaching. But we do have many institutions who, have gone through this whole pandemic, the past few months. They have got over this emergency remote instruction. Now they're really asking serious questions. How do I ensure that, my online offering, my online class is of quality? So there is a QM quality course design guide that we have created, and we'll be happy to share with anyone. So this is the end of my short presentation, and I just want to remind us all, especially if you're a faculty or if you're an instructional designer and you are in the trench, you are teaching our students, you are supporting our faculty on a daily basis. Two major concepts that you can take away from here is one is alignment, okay? Everything in your online course needs to be aligned to serve one single purpose, is to help students achieve the learning outcomes. That's one. Second, the online environment needs to be a user-friendly, learning-centered ecosystem for the students. They can interact, they should be engaging, and you have all the resources to support them. So thank you for your time, and thank you for being here. Take your time to be part of this. And here's my email, ygao@qualitymatters.org, if you have any questions. So, Alan, back to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Dr. Yaping Gao, for a very, very valuable reminder at a very practical and useful level. And I can see in some of the chat that people have found it very valuable and helpful. So thank you once again. Well, we have some just over 15 minutes for some conversation. And we have some very good, interesting questions and issues raised in the question and answer stream. Let me bring one up first of all, and perhaps start with Professor Acosta Aide. Professor Madhulika Kaushik, who is Provost Chancellor at Usha Martin University in India, asks about strategies for learner engagement in blended learning environments. Whether students who stay quiet, whether we used to call these students lurkers, but I think they've now been made more respectable by being called legitimate peripheral participants. There are clearly issues about strategies for learning engagement. And Professor Acosta Aide, may I come to you first, and then I'll come back to Dr. Gao. Professor Acosta Aide, do you have comments on how we support students in their engagement online, particularly in blended environments?
Well, I think that one of the lessons learned in this pandemic is that students adapt very well to new environments, whereas teachers find it more difficult to do that because, well, that's logical, because they have to lead the activities and they have to manage the teaching and learning in the new context, in the new environment. But if we want to transition from traditional on-campus lessons, classes, lectures to blended learning, I think that major changes must occur in institutions. In relation to students, my opinion is that students need to be trained to behave within the new context and the new approach. Blended learning involves a whole new approach to learning and teaching. And if we want to develop learning-centric systems within a blended learning approach, of course, students need more training. They need to be motivated. We know that very usually students are conservative in relation to learning habits, even though they may be ahead of us in the use of networking technologies. They turn out to be very conservative in the use of technologies for learning. So they need to be trained, they need to be motivated. But prior to that, I think that institutions have to carry out major curricular changes in order to make blended learning happen in their institutions, if we want to take lessons from this crisis. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I come back now to Dr. Yaping Gao? Do you have some comments on learner engagement, Dr. Gao?
Yes, as I mentioned in my presentation, engagement needs to be designed in, built in. It just does not happen. And that's especially true for students who are traditionally, shy and like reserved. So by built in, I mean, so for example, if you post a discussion question, right, your instructions need to be very specific, saying, you need to answer this question, and maybe even, by when and how long, your answer needs to be, etc. Students need to have a purpose in order to do things. We are all the same, because if we do not have something to motivate us to complete something, we tend to say, oh, I'm going to do it tomorrow, I'm going to do it next week. So everything needs to be tied into their, grades or, etc., or their performance or their evaluation. And even for those traditionally reserved and students, if in online environment, many of them performs very well because they, tend to think a lot, and the online environment provide them this opportunity to think ahead and compose a well thought of a message or, composition. And other than, as long as they can use the technology. And also the other thing that we have to think about is students all over the world are very active in social media as well. So, it's not like they're not comfortable going online to do certain things. It's just that in the online course, you need to build those opportunities for interaction and engagement for a purpose. It is a part of their work in the course. Then they will do it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me come to another question raised by Anita van Vlerken, who I believe is from the Netherlands. And she raises an issue in the field of academic integrity. In particular, asks about plagiarism and how this can be managed in online assessment activities. And Professor Acosta Aide, do you have a comment on how we manage plagiarism? Is this a greater problem in online assessment? And if so, how do we manage it?
Yes, it is quite a concern for universities when especially campus-based classes were transferred to the virtual platforms, and examinations had to be were taken by students within the virtual platforms. Integrity, plagiarisms have become major issues with students and their performance at examinations. I think that the best way to deal with those issues is to train students in ethical values. I mean, besides putting in place proctoring systems, that's necessary, of course, that's out of question. I think that training students in integrity, in moral values, in trying to make them be aware that they have to perform ethical levels of behavior, which are going to be crucial in their future professional careers, is basic. And this is something universities, in my opinion, have dropped to some extent. We have been excited with new ways of learning, teaching, with technologies, digital skills, and so on. But to some extent, we have forgotten the human basis that a future professional needs for performing in the new society and in all kinds of society, which is moral values, ethical standards, and integrity. So training them in those fields is basic for me.
Thank you, thank you. Very, very interesting answer. Dr. Gav, the issue of plagiarism, academic integrity, managing these in an online environment, what do you think?
Yes, so in one of my slides, I showed this study by Andrew Venture. There's, hardware, software that the institution can implement to ensure academic integrity. And I totally agree with Dr. Acosta's view on, we kind of have got somewhat lost, all right? Because we really need to re-emphasize the value of honesty, the value of academic integrity on the part of the students as well, because they become the after school they go into the society. They need to be a trustworthy citizen to contribute to the society. The other thing that I want to I just remind everybody, and I know that institutions all over the world has policies on academic integrity, and certainly, and during your orientation, the first time you interact with your students, ensure that they understand that this is a part of their academic integrity policy they need to adhere to. Now, on the course level, again, if you design your assessment in such a way, and for example, if you have some, 4 or 5 essays, if this is a composition course, you want to make sure that students understand that their own perspective, you value, as the faculty, you value their own creative thinking based on their own life experience or based on the content that they're studying. You value their own perspective, that they actually do not need to copy somebody else's idea. You want to make sure the assessments or the learning activities are authentic from them. So, and I just want to say I'm not tied to any of those companies, but there are softwares. There are actually some software was online. If you Google, you don't have to pay. There are web-based applications that you can actually easily incorporate into your course, or you can use, copy and paste the composition and into the online environment, and it would actually tell you how much, is authentic and how much is probably plagiarism. Other than that, there are, standing commercial tools like Turnitin, like a Gridmark, like a Safe Assign. All of this have been in the market for the past at least 20 years. So if your institution or your program has this commitment to ensure that, in this aspect, they can certainly look into those tools. And again, I'm not tied to any of these companies. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gav. Thank you. Well, we're beginning to run out of time, and I've got one question here from Sylvia Elena Morrow, which is such an interesting one that I want to make sure that our panelists have a chance to answer it. So, Professor Acosta Aida, if I come to you first. Sylvia asks, will all these changes endure? Do you think that all these changes that have come about as an emergency are going to stay with us and remain integral to the way we work? Or do you think things rather will go back to, quotes, normal, close quotes?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. And I think that's the challenge. I'm not sure that all the things, all the new practices we've been assuming during the crisis will remain when we go back to normal. I'm not sure about that. That's a challenge which university leaders, and when I say leaders, I'm not meaning just the highest authorities in each university, but also teachers, deans, teachers, heads of departments, I mean the faculty. That's a decision which depends on us. In the urgencies of getting through and overcoming all the hurdles that have been coming up in the crisis, we may forget to evaluate our practices, to be reflect upon what should remain or what lessons we should take out of a crisis. And this is just the challenge. For me, it's the basic point, the most important thing to think about. What are we going to learn from this emergency period? What practices which should be previously evaluated by teachers and by university leaders will remain? And what changes are we going to promote as a result of that evaluation and a result of that reflection upon this crisis? This is it.
Thank you, thank you. Dr. Gao, are these changes forever, or do you think we're going to go backwards again once, let's hope we do get COVID under control?
Right. So, you know, I cannot like agree with Dr. Acosta more that, you know, we are here, we're still in the pandemic, the whole worldwide, and we just cannot wait for this to be over. However, certain things that we struggled through, we survived, and we learned how to do it is going to stay. Online education, in a very general, broad sense, is going to get bigger and bigger. So come with that is, you know, working from home, virtual learning, you know, digital environment. As long as the technology stays, as long as the technology still prevails, improves, things that we do online is going to stay. All the lessons, all the best practice, the whole collective international education community have learned through this is going to stay one way or the other. In my view, moving forward, even if the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, pass behind us, we all get vaccines and everybody feels safe and secure. Down the road, there will be other crises. There will be other pandemics, you know, things are going to happen. So at the individual level, you know, the student level, the faculty level, you know, at the program level, at the institutional level, we have learned a lot from this. So moving forward, the hybrid mood is going to stay. Faculty, you have learned so much through all of this. You have developed your content, developed your assessment. You have learned a new way to teach online, the online pedagogy. These are valuable. And all of this, you are going to impart to your own traditional, you know, face-to-face classroom teaching, like the principle of alignment, like, you know, you engage students. All of this are wonderful. They're going to stay here. So moving forward, most of the schools, most of the faculty are still going back to, you know, the traditional face-to-face, but your focus will be different. You are probably not going to feel it's necessary to stand in front of classroom, lecture 1 hour, 2 hour, day in and day out, because you have your course shell in the learning environment, in your learning management system. You feel like your PowerPoint, your chapter summary, you know, certain learning activities can be put inside there, can be left there. Let students do view it on their own. When you do meet your students, you focus on the most important thing that you have to do with them inside the class, face to face, like labs, like discussions, like project, like teamwork, those kind of thing. So if there's a one silver line that, you know, we have to have out of all this is that, you know, moving forward after the pandemic is over, everybody in the learning community, in the education community globally will feel they are more confident using technology. They learn a lot more of how to actually teach online, remotely, distance, however you call it. And then moving forward, the interaction between the students and the faculty and the supporting staff will be even more tight, and in various ways that we have learned to do all of this. So I'm very hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I share your optimism, I must say. So I'm afraid I have to bring this wonderful webinar to a close, even though we haven't been able to discuss some of the very interesting questions raised. So I would like us to have had a chance to discuss the questions raised by Saroj Pandey from India about student stress due to the digital divide, the stress for students about the cost of downloads, which Juliana Ndunaga raises from Nigeria, and the issues raised by Karen Ferreira Myers from Swaziland about the Bloom's taxonomy being revised by Andrew Church for online context. But all those questions will have to wait for another occasion. Maybe they will be raised at our November webinar. So do please keep checking ICDE's website and our social media to see when that will take place. Incidentally, if you don't spend time on ICDE website, you're missing something because there's so many good resources there. So I do recommend it. So let me bring this webinar to an end. I want to thank our two speakers. First of all, Dr. Yaping Gao, thank you so much indeed from Quality Matters in the USA. It's been a most valuable contribution. And Professor Santiago Acosta Aide from Loja University in Ecuador, thank you again for your contribution. I want to thank ICDE as our hosts, our global organization. This has been truly a global event, and I think we've got so much to learn across the boundaries and borders. So thank you to ICDE. And last but not least, thank you to Julie Shearing, who has made all this possible with her excellent preparation for the meeting. So thank you to everybody, and I will now bring this webinar to a close. Thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.